Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. This is the second in a short series on kind of the basics of CSS Grid. And last time I showed you how this parent grid container will create these automatic rows for you. We created these columns explicitly, and then it just stacks them all out for you automatically. I also showed you how to make this truly auto-responsive blog post layout here that'll snap down when it needs to and try to fill up as many cards as it can in the width that you give it. Now today I'm going to show you how to set out these overlapping titles over an image like this, which normally you'd have to use like a weird negative margin or some kind of absolute positioning, but with Grid it's really pretty simple. And then finally I'll show you how to do a full page layout like this with a nav bar, a header, you've got ads over here, the title or the post itself, related posts, and then down here at the bottom you've got a footer. So I'll show you how to do that second. First of all, let's go ahead and work on this overlapping title. Okay, so if I jump over this way, the first thing I'm going to do is come to the parent here. I'm going to say display of grid. If I do that, automatically it starts to stretch out like we talked about last time. So if I click down here, you'll see that everything is stretching to full width. Now this image isn't, but that's because it's locked into its aspect ratio. I have a max width of 100% on this image. So that means if I were to come in here and say width of 100% like this, it'll actually stretch to fill the full cell. You see it's doing that there. Now there's a couple things I want to mention as we get going here. Last time I mentioned that the grid itself always stretches to full width and pulls all of its children that way. There's actually another way to define grid though that I haven't talked about called inline grid. And basically what it does is it turns the grid into an inline element, so it only takes up the maximum space required. So if I change this to inline grid and come back up this way, you'll notice that's what it's doing. It's acting like an inline element, and that's why this margin auto isn't working. So if I take this off, it doesn't do anything because it's inline. I'm also going to take off this max width too, just so you can kind of see it naturally as it sits. So right now, because I've got this image width at 100%, it's stretching all the way across. If I pull up here, it goes back to its normal amount. Now let me show you a couple other things. Let's come down to the dev tools. Let me click on this, and if I click on this down here, you might remember that last time I showed you that you can move the children within their cells. So you see how the image is on the right there. I can move them over. So if I click over here, justify items, it actually moves that over. Or I can move everything in the center like that. That's what I showed you last time. I also showed you align items works the same way. Now justify content and align content actually moves the entire parent container within its desired, or with its section on the page, to the right or to the left, or spaces between them, or all that kind of stuff. So these two I didn't get to show you last time. So if I refresh here, I can show you a couple of other things. First of all, let's go ahead and switch this back to grid, and then pull this back up. And if I come back up this way, I should be able to actually move the content all the way over. Now it's not moving, and that's actually because one of the children is taking up the full width. So let's get rid of this just so I can show you how the align content and justify content works. Come back over this way, and now I should be able to move the entire container itself that's holding really just one cell right now over one way or the other, or to the middle. So that's how those two properties work. Align content would work the same way, just up and down. All right, let me refresh and come back over this way. Let's put back on our max width and our margin here. Now, one thing I will mention is if you're using what I showed you last time with this auto fit min-max, you cannot put a max width on this parent. It'll break that, so you have to actually wrap it with something else like this and put a max width on the parent. So that's one thing to pay attention to depending on how you repeat those columns and stuff like that. Now today what I'm going to be doing is actually defining columns, not with a repeat function, but just with hard numbers here. So if I come back up this way, what we're going to do is say grid template columns, and then let's get rid of this, and I'll come in here and I'm going to say 2 fraction, 0.5 fraction, and 1 fraction. Now, if I save here, let me go ahead and pull up this grid, and you're going to see what I've got here is I've got it dividing into 3 spots. This is 1 fraction, this should be 0.5 fraction, and this should be twice as much as this one and quite a bit more than this one. However, Grid isn't sure what to do, so it's just placing these in the next cells available, and this is the minimum content space this can fit in because of this large title. Let's ignore that for now and think about what we want, and then we'll place these properly in the cells we want. When it comes to the rows, we want the image to take up the full height, but we want this title to basically only take up the middle section. So let me come in here and I'm going to say grid template rows like this. And here I'm going to use percentages. I'll say 20% and then 60% and then 20%. And I'll save it. Now when I do that, now it's not sure what to do. But if I come in here, you can see those are my grid lines now. I got 20% at the top, 60% as the row, and 20% at the bottom. Now where do I want all the children to be in their relative cell? Well, I want them to be in the center of their cell if possible. And I can do that again by coming down here, clicking this little grid icon. Let's see, overlap container, is that the right one? Yeah. I'll click this grid icon and I want it to be align items center. Now, you might say, what is going on? Well, they're both in these first two cells because that's where Grid has naturally placed them, and they're in the center of their cells. That's what it's doing. So let me do that. So I'll say align items of center, like that. And again, align items and justify items are for the children. Now let's go ahead and set this width back to 100%, and we're actually going to set the height to 100% as well. And if I do that, you'll see that now it's smashing itself in that little cell. So what I need to do is say object fit, and I'm going to do, let's see, cover, like that. Okay, so now it's just in that cell, but it's stretching to kind of fill that area. And obviously it needs to span more than just that cell, so for now that's going to look a little odd, but we'll get around to that. So how do you decide where a child sits in its parent cells? That's really kind of the focus of this video, and I'm going to show you two ways. This first way will be by using grid lines or grid line names. So in this method, you actually declare this on the children. I can come in here and say grid column start like this, and I can tell it which column I want it to start at. Now, if I click this little grid in Chrome, it's going to tell me the numbers here I need to pay attention to. You could actually name these as well. Like I come in here and I could say like first line and jump back over this way. It's not showing yet. Let me jump over to here. And in the layout settings, I can change this to say show line names, and it will show first line. Now, by default, it's going to give numbers, and I think the numbers are probably easier to work with. So let's just remove this, and we'll just use the numbers. So if I come back over here to my grid column start, and I click on here again, I'm wanting it to start at number 1, and I want it to go all the way to number 3. So that means I would say 1 here, copy this down, let's change this to end, and I'm going to end this at 3. Now, I can do a shorthand here if I prefer, where I can just say grid column, and then I do 1/3. Same way, it's going to actually stretch it to that full section. Now notice what it's done. It said, hey, oh, you want it to take these first two cells because you've defined those columns explicitly. I'm going to just put the next element in this next cell. If I'd said 1 to 4, it would have wrapped this down here and put it in this cell. So it's kind of guessing. It's guessing wrong, but it's trying, so that's good. All right, let's move these down. And we're going to do not only grid column, but we also want grid row. So let's say row right here, and then row right here. Now, before I save, let's come over here and just make sure we know what we want. We want it to start at row 1, and we want it to go all the way to row 4 down here. Now, you can define these either by those positive numbers, or if you're going to the last one, you can just do negative whatever. So in this case, it would be -1. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can define it as -1, -2, -3, and -4. So that means I could come in here and say, I want it to start at 1 and go to -1, go to the final line in the grid parent. Now, if I save this, it's actually now positioning itself exactly where we want it to, this whole area. Now, let's go a little quicker here. I can use the same shorthand as I did before, by the way. Let's see, grid row of 1 and -1, like that. Let's go ahead and position this card quickly, and then I'll show you one other kind of shorthand. So we'll come down here and click on grid, and where do we want the card to start? We want it to start at basically column 2 and go to column 4, or as much space as it needs. And then I want it to go from row 2 down to row 3. So let me just grab, let's grab all of this right here. Let's bring it down this way, and let me get rid of this one and get rid of this one. And we're changing this to 2 to 4, or we could do -1 since it's the last one. And this one will be 2 to 3. And if I save it, now it positions itself right there. Now I'll come here and click this grid, and you'll notice because we did align item center, it's right there in the center. Now, this image is always going to be stretching that full section because I have 100% width, 100% height, and object fit cover on it. So the only thing that this align items is affecting is this one child. So I mentioned you can space things out with the parent like we've been doing. You can actually also do it by the child. So if I come in here and I get rid of that, it's going to naturally just go to the top of its cell area like that. But what it's doing is it's stretching the card to fit the whole area, including the content is kind of getting warped. So I can come in here and instead of defining that on the parent, I can say align self on a child and say center. So you can do either parent or child. Basically, usually I use the parent unless it's only one element, or if I want to overwrite what I have on the parent, you can overwrite it by doing something on the child like this. I mentioned one other shorthand, and what you can do is instead of saying grid row and grid column, you can just say grid area, and then what you're going to do is alternate row, column, row, column. So my row is 2, and then I usually like to do it like this. I go from 2 to 3, and then I come back in and fill in the columns. To me, that helps me kind of figure out exactly where I want it, and that's the exact same thing as these two, and that's the same as declaring it 2 times on the column and 2 times as the row. Now that button's an inline element and it's not sure what to do, so let's go ahead and say display grid here, and then let's do a gap of like 0.5 rem, something like that, so that this card is its own grid parent. And again, you might say, why is that button stretching all the way across? Well, remember, all the children always take up the full cell space, so that's the full cell space. How do we change that? Well, there's 2 ways. We can change it with the parent like we were doing before, so I could come in here and say, let's justify items all the way over on their start. Or I can come to the child, that's the button right here, and I can say justify self start, like that. And it will just pull that one item all the way over, and the rest of these will actually stretch always to their full width. All right, now when we get a little bit smaller here, you'll notice that because we haven't redefined how those columns are laid out, it's not auto-responsive. I'm not going to show you how to do that just for sake of time today, but all you would do is do a media query and then change where these things are. And then you would change the grid area for both the image and this content as well. All right, let's go ahead and move to kind of the big project, this full page layout. Now I mentioned there's 2 ways to declare where the children go within their parent. The first is what we just did by using those grid areas and the cell lines. However, you can also use what's called grid area templates. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to name each of not the lines, but the cells themselves. You're going to name them in your parent, and then you're going to decide which child goes where based on those names. So let's come down to this area here for layout. The first thing I need to do is come in here and I need to add display of grid. And if I save that, it will stack everything up as it deems best, kind of in all of its areas, and it's messing it up royally, but it needs a little bit of instruction. So it's basically just saying, hey, this is the first cell, I'll put the image there. This is the next area, I'll put something there, then here, then here. It's just auto-generating these rows, implicitly defining them. The footer finally goes in the last one. So it's implicitly defining the columns and the rows. Let's give it a little bit more instruction. So I'm going to say grid template areas now this time. And what we're going to do is define the names of these cells, like I mentioned. This is the other way to do it. Rather than using those grid lines, you can define these areas. The way we do that is by adding these quotation marks, and then what I can do is I can name them. So I could say a nav up here. And then I just do a space, no comma or anything like that, and I can name the next one. We'll call this header, and then I'll name the next one. I'll call this ads, and then we'll do another one. We'll name it content, and then we'll do sidebar, and then finally we'll do footer. If I save it like this, it's actually defining these areas, and if I click grid here, it's going to show me nav, header, ads. It's hard to see that with the numbers there. Content, so it's guessing where these things should go, and because I've just got them stacked up like that in the HTML, it's guessing correctly. All right, I want them one after the other stretched all the way across. Now let's come over here and add a little bit of space between them, which again, as grid, you're going to let the parent do the heavy lifting with spacing. And of course, you can do padding on all these if you want, but it's much easier to say gap of like 2 rem, something like that. All right, keep jumping me around on the page. Let me get rid of everything else so that we don't have to keep doing that, and I'll be right back with you. All right, this is all we've got on our page. That should definitely help us now. So this looks great for like a mobile, and this is mobile first, the way I'm designing this, to where on mobile, you got the nav bar up top, you got this header image, the ads, the title, all this kind of stuff. Let's start to pull out a little bit more, and I've already got these media queries defined here, and this first one is for 600 pixels. So the next kind of stage up, which would be about right here, I want to change it just slightly. Well, what do I want to do? Well, let's come back here to grid template areas. And here I actually want to go too wide now. So I'm saying I want 2 columns. So I'll say nav, nav, and then I'll say header, header. So I want the header to stretch all the way across. And then I'll say ads and content. And then at the bottom, I'll say sidebar, sidebar. And then I'm going to say footer, footer, like this. So what I'm doing is basically defining I want 5 rows and I want 2 columns. Now you do actually have to have the equal number of column items here. So if I just said ads like that, it's not going to stretch all the way across. It just won't know what to do. So that's why I have to say header, header, nav, nav, sidebar, sidebar. I'm actually defining those and explicitly telling it where these children are going to sit. Now, if I save this, it's not going to exactly know what to do because I haven't named any of these things. So with this method, when you're using these names, you actually have to give names to the children so that they know which they are. So I can come down here and say grid area nav. That's what I've done here. Now, I can also say grid area header, and it knows it goes there. Let me copy these down. We'll go grid area ads and grid area content, and then grid area sidebar, and then finally grid area footer. So that first one I already had ready, but the rest of these I don't. But as soon as I name these, you'll see now they all fit in their spot. Ads go here, content goes here. Now, this is taking up equal width because it's basically going to use the children's content to decide how wide these columns should be. It's implicitly defining the columns like it did the rows up above. But I can actually tell it exactly what I want those columns to be. Now, because I've just said I want 2, I haven't said anything about how big they should be. It's not sure and it's guessing like I mentioned, but I can come in here and say grid template columns, and I'm going to say 250 pixels and 1 fraction. So take the remaining space. That means the ads here, it's the only thing that's really messing with this is the ads because everything else already stretches all the way across. We'll only take 250 pixels and this will take the remaining space. Now you'll notice something. If I start to scroll here and look down, all of these are stretching all the way to fill basically the same area as this content. Well, how do we fix that? Well, again, you can come in here to the grid right here, and I can click on this little icon here, and I can decide where I want these things to be placed. Items are about the children, so that's what I'm looking for. And if I say start, they'll no longer stretch the full height. So what I'm looking for then is align, items, start. Now remember, just like I showed you above, you can actually do this on the children instead. So if I remove that and I say this is really the only thing I care about when it comes to that, this will always be shorter than the content over here. I could just come to the ads and I could say what? Align self start. Same exact thing. And that will stretch them up that way. Let's just do it on the parent. I typically tend to do it on the parent. So let's do it back up this way. Okay. Now, when I get to 1,000 pixels, how does this change? Let me go ahead and copy this down because a lot of it will be similar, so there's no reason to type again. But we're going to want 3 rows this time. So we'll want nav, 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 header, 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 all the way across. This time I want the sidebar to come up on this side, and then I'm actually going to get rid of the 4th row and just have a footer. Now if I save it here, it's not going to work, and that's because I haven't given this equal columns the whole way. So I actually need to add footer, footer, footer. And one thing to mention is that you don't actually have to fill every single cell. So I could come over here and just add a dot, and what that will do is basically add nothing there. It'll be an empty cell. I could also add a dot here, and I could add a dot up here. All right, so let's leave it like that now, and I'll change it in a second. Because we need to actually now tell it how these columns should be arranged. So far, I've told it 250 pixels and 1 fraction. Now, if I come down here, I need to actually change this up. In this case, what I want is the main content to take up most of the space and the 2 sidebars, the ads and the sidebar itself, to take up smaller amounts. I can do this in a bunch of different ways, but remember we've got this fraction unit, and I think that's the easiest because the browser figures it out for us. So if I just say 1 fraction, 3 fractions, 1 fraction, that's what it'll do. Now right now nothing's happening, but that's because we're not at 1,000 pixels. If I do that, you'll now see that that is what's happening. This is taking up 1 fraction, 3 fractions, and 1 fraction. I could come in here and change this to 2, and now that would be a little bit bigger, or I could change this to like 0.5, 0.4, and it would try to shrink, and it's actually cutting things off because, again, I'm explicitly defining these columns. So I'll say 1 fraction, 3 fraction, and 1 fraction, because that's what I actually want. Now, if I come in here and click the grid, you'll notice something, and that is that this cell here and this cell here, this cell here and this cell here have nothing in them. And that's because I have given them these little dots. Now this one, it's actually just that the nav doesn't stretch far enough to get all the way over there. But if I remove this by doing a dot here, the nav will go all the way over to the right. So you don't have to fill every cell, and that's another really nice way of using grid. You can position things where you want them to be. Now let's go ahead and add these back in because I actually do want the nav stretching all the way across, and I do want the header stretching all the way across, although you may not want that in your design. And now what you've created is a fully responsive, full layout page by just switching those things around in different media queries. And you can position them wherever you want. We've taken the sidebar from below the content all the way down here to suddenly right next to the content. And we've done that just with these grid template areas. So those are the two ways you can position children in the cells you want them. You can use the grid lines above, and I usually use those for simpler layouts or for layouts when I know I just want it to go to the last row or the last column, so I use that -1, but I'm not exactly sure what that will be. Now, if you're really visual, you can come in here and actually space these out better so that they actually line up, and that works just fine. It doesn't break anything. As long as you don't have additional elements there, you can actually space these out so you can definitely see, okay, I've got 3 exact columns, I've got 5 exact rows, and everything is spaced out visually for you to see, and that works the exact same. You can do the same thing with these dots, so I don't have to just have 1 dot, I can have like, I don't know, 4 dots or 3 dots so that it lines up, and that works just the same. It just spaces them out as long as you don't have a space, because that would create a 4th column, and then you'll break everything. All right, so hopefully that's a help to kind of be able to visualize those if that's kind of more the way you think. I hope these 2 videos were a big help to you, and that in this video in particular, you learned how to place children in their parent cells. And you do that either by using those grid lines, or you can give grid template area names and then space them out visually like this. Either way, you should know enough now with grid to be able to lay out pages however you like, move things around dynamically, and make some awesome pages. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and happy coding.